You're not going to get over it. You're going to move on with it. And it will change and you will change. And I think that's the objective, is to figure out how to integrate it. I mean, I'll always be a griever. I will grieve every single day for the rest of my life. And I wouldn't have it any other way. Those are my people. And I mourn for them and I grieve the loss of them. And I have joy and I can laugh and I can do things, because if I'm going to grieve every day for the rest of my life, I also want to be able to live life and enjoy. And I know they'd want that for me too.
Welcome to Lost and Found. On today's episode, we have Jessica Fein. Jessica is the author of Breathtaking, which truly, truly is a love story. Her writing in this book is just, you can feel the love on the page. And Jessica has experienced multiple losses, all completely different. One being her 17-year-old daughter to a rare disease called MERRF Syndrome. Jessica talks about how grief can be so isolating and how it is so important to take care of yourself and have an identity outside of your caregiver role. I really hope you enjoyed this episode, and thank you so much for watching. Jessica, thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're so welcome. So I do want to say this first. Your book, Breathtaking, I finished it 2 days ago, and very early in the book, you say that it's a love story, and it 100% is. I felt the love on the pages, and I feel so honored to have read your story. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for saying that and for acknowledging that that's what it is, a love story, because that's really what I felt, first of all, while I was living through it, but, for the purposes of this conversation, while I was writing it. And that is what I wanted to convey.
And you totally did. Why don't we get started with you sharing a little bit about yourself and your journey?
Yes. So my book really begins with my first major loss, which was the loss of my sister. My sister Nomi died suddenly at age 30, and I was 27. And that was the first of many, many losses to come. But it was the first that was totally earth-shattering for me. It was, really cracked open any concept I had, any illusion I had that, things are supposed to be fair, or, we have some control, anything like that just kind of went away, never to return, for better and for worse. And then I talk about the very long and twisty road my husband and I took to building our family. We went through infertility treatments for 5 years. And at the end of that 5 years, really changed our dream of having children to creating a family through adoption. And we went to Guatemala and we adopted 3 babies, not at the same time, I should say that. And thought that the hard part was over. We thought, okay, now we're going to be on cruise control. I mean, of course it'll be chaotic. We'll have 3 babies, but we thought the tough part was over. And then our middle child, our daughter Dahlia, when she was 5, was diagnosed with an ultra rare degenerative disease called MERRF Syndrome, which stands for myoclonic epilepsy, ragged red fibers. And for the next 12 years, Dahlia lived to 17. I went through a number of transformations, one of which was moving from thinking I could personally cure this incurable disease. And that, again, that issue of, how much control do we really have? And can we fix things if we just put our minds to it? To realizing that that was not a problem I could solve. There were other problems I could solve. That one wasn't it. And that the goal was really to figure out how to create a life of joy and meaning in the midst of these incomprehensible circumstances.
You had mentioned in your book that you had an outlook of, if you put your mind to it, you can make whatever you want happen. Did your experience with your daughter, did that change your outlook on that perspective you had?
Oh, 100%. I mean, so backing up to the day of the diagnosis, when we were told that my daughter had a mitochondrial disease, which is what MERRF syndrome is, I did not know what mitochondria were. Okay. Like, it sounded familiar, but I had no idea. And still I thought like, okay, this is what we do. We kiss the boo-boo and make it better. And this is that times a billion. And I'm going to figure it out. And I'm smart and I can, find the researchers and find the studies. And, I really thought it's a matter of just, if we try hard enough, right? We're all told that, like, you can get whatever you want in life. You just got to put your mind to it. Right. And so ultimately, there was a turning point when I realized that's not going to be the end of the story. And in the meantime, while I'm trying to, fix this unfixable thing, I've got this amazing daughter who just wants to be a child. And I've got two other children and I have to give them some kind of childhood and some kind of life and not be chasing a fantasy.
I feel like that happened for me, but after my mom died, I was like, okay, so everything I thought I believed is questionable now.
Right. Yes. And that I think, I had that kind of awakening really with my sister's death, which had happened a couple of decades earlier, but it really did just change my whole outlook. In the book, I say, I had been living in this like beautiful, comfortable, hazy bubble, right? Just things kind of going along in a pretty manageable way. And my sister's death punctured the bubble. And then from then on, I saw things through the clarity of the puncture, not through the hazy sheen. It changed how I saw everything.
Your first sister was all of a sudden.
Yes. Yes. Like I had been on the phone with her a couple of hours earlier and we were chit-chatting about silly stuff, like sisters do. And it was sudden, like she was playing with her baby and she went into cardiac arrest. It's like a lot of athletes, we hear these stories, finished basketball practice and went into cardiac arrest. It was like that, only without the basketball practice.
You experienced, it was, tell me if I'm wrong, your sister, mother, father, your other sister, and then your daughter.
Correct.
That is such an accumulation of losses. How did each one differ for you? And did you handle them differently as they happened?
Totally. So yes, each one was individual and had its own set of circumstances and could be its own book and maybe one day will be. But because there were so many, they all became tangled up together. So each one was compounded by whatever came before, culminating, of course, in the, perhaps most profound. I don't know. They were all profound, but people say, losing a child is a different category. I don't necessarily believe that. I think they're all unique. But when my daughter died, I wanted to like crawl into my mother's lap. I wanted to hold my sister's hand. So the fact that these key people in my life weren't there, that made me, it's like this ball of yarn. That's how I envision it, where each loss is a piece of string, but they are so tangled up in each other now. There were even visuals that went along with it. So I'm Jewish and the funerals take place in this particular funeral home. And, going for my first sister's death, and, we're in the family room before and it's this table and we're all around the table. And, then the next one, there's one person less at the table, one person fewer, and then so on until I'm sitting there at my daughter's around the table meeting with the rabbi before the funeral. And it's just, it's me and my husband, et cetera, but my family of origin. And I was lucky because I was so tight with my family. So, I talk a lot about being blessed and being cursed in the book because I was so blessed. I know that some people don't have siblings who are also such great friends. And, my parents were divorced. It was not like Leave It to Beaver in any way, but I had very, very close relationships with every member of my family. And that was a blessing. Then, of course, the flip side is them, each one dying prematurely.
Did you find that you had anticipatory grief with your daughter or your sister or your mother because you knew something? Did you have any anticipatory grief with those and how did that show up?
First of all, you totally got that right. Like some of the deaths were sudden and some were elongated, and you completely got that right. So thank you for that. I think that I had ambiguous grief more than anticipatory grief. And the thing is, until I had ambiguous grief, even after I had been having it for a while, I didn't know what it was. Anticipatory grief, we know, right? I mean, it is what it sounds like. And sure, I had some of that. But this other thing, ambiguous grief, was really, really powerful. And what happened was I was, along the way of my daughter's illness, I do a lot of speaking, and I was invited to speak on a panel about ambiguous grief. Anytime I am invited to speak about these issues, I will say yes, because it's very important for me to raise awareness. So I was like, yes, absolutely. And then I hung up the phone and I went and I Googled what's ambiguous grief. I mean, I was going to be on this panel. I had never heard of it. And I learned that ambiguous grief is when we're grieving for somebody who isn't dead, right? Different from anticipatory grief, because ambiguous grief can mean maybe they're not with us in the physical sense, like they're a prisoner of war or something, or maybe they're with us physically, but they're cognitively different, like maybe dementia or an addiction. And in my daughter's case, because it was a degenerative disease, her ability to communicate with us changed from being able to have a conversation to being able to mouth words, being able to point, use a device, to being totally frozen, where she could not move, could not communicate for 2 years. So it's those kinds of like really slow losses where you are grieving. I mean, it is real and it is valid. And I had prided myself on this notion that I wasn't going to grieve for my daughter while she was still alive. That didn't feel like it was fair to her, and it didn't feel like it was fair to me. And yet there was immense loss. I mean, every function, whether that was speaking or eating or walking, she lost those functions. And there was the loss of the future I had imagined. That's all very real grief. I just didn't know that. And once I learned that we can grieve without a funeral, so to speak, it took some of the power away, because I understood it was a real thing. And it allowed me to begin to integrate it rather than, try to push it away unsuccessfully.
Mm-hmm. I feel like with grief, it ripples into aspects of your life that you don't even realize it's going into until in hindsight, you're like, oh, that relationship sucked because yes. I was grieving.
Yes. And also you feel so other, right? I mean, the number of conversations I would be in with friends where I'd feel like, okay, first of all, totally recognizing they were in a no-win situation. Because when they would talk about their kids, a lot of my friends had kids Dahlia's age or around Dahlia's age, and they would talk about the things they were going through, whatever, like, trying to get into such and such school or sprain their ankle in the gymnastics final, these things that were almost like an affront to me. Like, are you serious? How could you possibly be talking about that? On the other hand, these are the very real things that are happening in people's lives if they can't talk to you about anything other than, this thing that's happening to you. So I recognized that they were in a no-win situation and felt so isolated because people really couldn't understand. And it would take far too long to try to explain because it was so complicated what was happening with, a degenerative disease is a particularly cruel kind of thing.
Did you find talking to your friends and when they're talking about like soccer practice or the little dilemmas with their children, did any like hostility or anger or jealousy appear for you? Because I feel like it would for me.
Yeah. I think that maybe not hostility, definitely jealousy. I mean, I forget the difference between jealousy and envy, right? One of them means like you don't want it for them. And one of them means whichever the one is that like, it wasn't that I didn't want them to have it. I just wanted it too. And still, I mean, Dahlia died in 2022 at 17. So to me, it's the weirdest thing. And I only have this with Dahlia's death, not with the others. She's like every age for me. So it's very painful when I'll see a little girl like skipping along, holding her mother's hand. I look at that and I'm like, oh, it makes me long for Dahlia. I'll see, 10-year-old girl, and I'll see then a girl who would, who's 20 or, whatever the ages that Dahlia will be. It's like she's still every single age. And that's really hard. I'll give you an example. I had a friend who had a child who was exactly Dahlia's age, who was having a graduation party. And I just felt like there's no way I can go to that. No way. And that wasn't really appreciated, why I couldn't go to that. And, it's hard. And it's hard for other people too. I mean, I know people try their best, but until you've gone through something personally, it's hard to really understand.
It really is. And you do feel isolated. I feel like so many times after my mom died, my friends would be like, "How are you?" And I'm like, "My mom died."
Okay. I wrote a whole article about the question, "How are you?" Because there is no way for us to answer that, right? Suppose they catch you at a particularly good moment and you're like, "Oh, things are going well." Then you're like, "Oh my God, how could things be going well? My mom died, my daughter died, my sister died," right? There's just no way to answer that question. And yet that's like the most generic question there is. We are asked it 100 times a day, and I call them morning minefields because I feel like you're just constantly trying to dodge the minefields, right? And, the thing about how are you that's funny is that I've spoken with a lot of people who are, grief therapists or in the grief space in some way. And they'll say, "Well, no, you really should ask, no, but how are you really?" Because that shows to the person that you really want to know. I'll tell you, when people say that to me, that doesn't help at all. I'm like, "Oh God, no."
Because then I just would go deeper in it,
Yeah.
I feel.
Yeah, it doesn't help at all.
And then I felt like I isolated a lot because my friends' problems were so minute.
Yes.
To the loss of a loved one in general. They'd be talking, like about a job or about a hiccup in their day. And I just felt I didn't want to have those conversations.
Right. Or they might say like, "Oh my God, my mom's driving me crazy." Right. Which is like a normal thing for somebody to say. And you're like, "How dare you?"
You have a mom.
Right. What I would do for my mother to be driving me crazy.
Yes. It's so true. So I feel like that's a huge thing with like the isolation and with my experience anyway. Did you find that it showed up in your body or your other relationships at all? Did it ripple into those aspects?
It didn't. The question about the body is an interesting one. Where it showed up in my body, I think, is that there would be times where either a lot of exhaustion, and I have other friends who have gone through grief and they felt almost wired, like they only felt good if they were moving and running and exercising, and that was very healing for them. And I felt a deep exhaustion. And I think that might also have been compounded by the fact that, at least for Dahlia, I was doing hands-on medical care for 8 years. So it was very physically exhausting, and also working full time, and also having all the, other kids, etc. Right. So I was physically exhausted. I think that, the one, we talked a little bit about blessings and curses. One blessing I have is that my partner, my husband, has been by my side for all of these losses. And obviously some of them being his losses as well. And, 87% of couples with a child with special needs, I'm not even talking about medically complex or child loss, split up. So I don't take for granted that we've had each other to rely on, even though our grief comes out in totally different ways because everybody's grief is so individual. So that has been a real blessing that I'm aware that I'm lucky.
You wrote that in your book too, that statistic, did you not?
It's mind blowing. I don't know if it was in my book or in an article I wrote, but it's crazy.
Yeah, I could be wrong, but I could have sworn maybe you wrote it and you and your husband were there at the same time when you saw that statistic.
Yes. And also, by the way, it's like it's a thing that people will say. We were watching some show the other night. It was like you have to be careful even of what kind of entertainment you invite into your life, right? Because that's another morning minefield. So we pick things like, it was a spy show or something, right? This is going to be, you know, totally different from sick kid kind of thing. And they're talking about, I don't know, something in the show was like these things that were like kids. It wasn't really kids. It was whatever the professional thing. And they said, oh, well, and you know, there's nothing worse than having a kid die or something. It was like so out of the blue. And we just looked at each other. We're like, are you kidding? Are you kidding? Like our escape show can't even be an escape.
That is so crazy. I was watching The Whale. Yes. The other day with Brandon Fraser. And it did not click till like halfway through the film. And I started sobbing. I was like, I can't watch this anymore. He knows he's going to die and he's trying to make a good relationship with his daughter. Like, I can't watch it. And like, it just randomly clicked. I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And then there was a time when it was like, so my elder sister died of lung cancer. And I swear there was a time, because I read a ton and I like to read a lot of books that are, you know, fiction and totally different and escape. And there was a time when it was like every single book I picked up, I'd be 8 pages in or 27 pages in and loving it. And then it's like, there's lung cancer or my mother died of breast cancer. It would be like, there's the breast cancer, you know, just rearing its head. And I was like, really? Can we not be like talking about who's, you know, dating or something frivolous? Like, this is my escape. But it's everywhere.
And the triggers are so wild like that.
You know, and it's interesting because a lot of things, whether you're reading or watching or whatever, there's trigger warnings for, you know, really, you know, some pretty scary, horrible things. But I haven't yet to see trigger warning. If you have lost somebody to, you know, you might not want to watch this.
And I feel like it's because no one wants to talk about it.
Well, nobody wants to talk about it. This is, I mean, I literally just did a TED talk on this very topic, and where I say that it's like, we feel like we have to whisper when we're talking about grief, or like use a euphemism or whatever. And I got to tell you, it makes no sense, because grief is the single most universal thing there is. Every single person is going to grieve. Every single person is going to have a front row seat to somebody else's grief. And so why are we so weird about it?
Yeah. And I found in my own life, I didn't realize some people had lost their parents until I brought up the fact that my mom just died. And I was like, wait, how are you not talking about it? Like, how are you just holding it in? Or what are you doing to, you know, feel some connection or move with it?
Yes. And then there's the whole other thing, which is you're expected to go about your daily life. And it's like, how does every single person who see me not know what I am going through? Because this, like, I feel like I'm a different human being than I was yesterday. I'll never forget the first time I went back to work after my sister died. I used to take the train to work. And I will never forget getting on that train and thinking, how is it possible that people are just like they were a week ago and just, you know, kind of not looking at me and knowing that my entire world has changed. And I think actually in the book, I mentioned that my sister felt that way after she had her baby. The first time she went out with without her baby, she was like, I feel like my world has changed so much. Why doesn't everybody else recognize it? Like, she felt like everybody should know she was a new mother, which was kind of adorable and sweet and whatever. And then, you know, fast forward a year and a half and I'm going, why doesn't everybody know that my sister just died? Because you feel like, how can I be expected to go through the motions, to take the train, to buy milk when my person's gone?
Do you find that you measure time before and after the loss?
I mean, it's so crazy. Yes. And I have to say, today is actually my mother's birthday. So I'll be having some cake later tonight for her, which is actually my youngest son. We were on the birthday of somebody who had died, and I was sad. And he was saying, why don't we celebrate their birthday? And I loved that, you know, so we will do that tonight for my mother's birthday. But yes, I definitely, everything's a before and after. And, you know, it's interesting because I don't think it gets easier as time goes on. It changes for sure. But in certain respects, it gets harder because I feel like we're further away from our person, like, you know, moving into a house that they've never seen, or, you know, whatever the thing is, you know, their voice becoming less clear in our head. Of course, you know, there are things that feel less raw over time, but it's complicated.
Yeah. My mom died a year and 8 months ago. And everything is, if I talk about something that happened 2 years ago, I'm like, That was before my mom died. Oh, this happened a month after my mom died because she died April 24th. This happened in May. Like everything.
It's like the total before and after. And then that's why one of the things was like, how many before and afters are we going to have in this lifetime? You know, because it becomes such a marker.
It really does. And my boyfriend didn't understand it. And I was like, I'm a different person.
Now, did your boyfriend know your mother or did he come on the scene after?
He knew my mother. He had met her, I believe, 4 times. Every time she came to visit, or we would go down there for holidays. And he was with me when I got the phone call. And I'm an only child. She wasn't remarried. So he helped me with the whole funeral and everything.
Wow. Yeah. I was with my now husband when my sister died. My older sister was single at the time. And I remember feeling like grateful that when my husband and I decided, you know, when we got engaged, that I would be spending my life with somebody who had known her, even though they hardly knew each other. I mean, like you're saying, you know, but it felt like it would be so impossible to be with somebody who had never even known.
Never met them, never knew their energy. It's true.
Yeah.
We'll be out and see stuff that he'll look at it and be like, that reminds me of your mom. And it's totally her energy. And I could not imagine being with someone that never met her.
Right. And that's another thing. Like, that's gorgeous that he'll say that, because so many people feel like, well, I don't want to bring it up. I don't want to remind you like you forgot or you're not thinking about your mom all the time, you know?
All the time. There's a book called Motherless Daughters. And so like I'm in the Facebook group and I'll see people write in it that their partners are not supportive, and people have like gotten divorces and stuff over them not being supportive. And I'm like, I just don't understand how you could not be.
That's Hope Edelman's book, right? Motherless. Yes. There's a quote from that book. I don't remember it by heart, but it was the one that resonated for me more than anything I've ever read, particularly with the loss of my mother, about how, you know, I'm kidding myself when I say that you're only there in the picture on my desk. You're in the curve of my elbow. You're in the, you know, and she goes on and on to say how much our mothers in particular, that's what she's writing about, are a part of who we are.
Yeah, they really are. And in everything we do. Yeah. I feel like, and like the partners we pick, everything. Yeah. Everything. So yeah, I was not thinking I was going to get teary-eyed today. Okay, so with any of your losses were also different. How did your grief change before and after the loss? Do any of them stick out to you that changed entirely? And you're like, oh, I didn't think it would feel like this, or how it's changed over time?
I think to a certain degree, I'm cautious when I say this because I'm trying to figure it out in my mind. You know, the shock was the most with my first loss. And A, it was sudden, and B, it was the first. And I was shaking. We got to the hospital. She had already died. We didn't know that when we got the call. And I was shaking. I mean, I was in physical shock. And in fact, it's the only thing I really remember about that whole time at the hospital and that whole, you know, initial time was the physical. You know, we were talking about was there a physical reaction. So I guess there was. And it was just this, like, I do believe I was actually in shock. And none of them had that to that extent. I will say that my other sister, while not a physical shock, there was a disbelief because we were the only 2 left of my original family. We thought we were in it together till old age. And even though there was a little bit of time to prepare because she had a diagnosis of lung cancer, it was totally out of the blue. She was at the doctor for something else altogether when she was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. And the whole thing still, even today, it is very hard for me to fathom that happened. So shock and disbelief, which I think are related, but are different things. And then, you know, with my parents, it was similar where one was sudden and one was expected. I don't think that it's easier, but it's less foreign.
Whenever you were reliving your dad's getting the phone call, that's very similar to like what happened when my mom died. And I could be wrong. When the EMT was talking to you, were you like, no, check? Like,
Totally. Oh my God. I was like, no. I literally was like, no, I don't think that's right. Like it made no sense. And they're like, we're going to take him to the hospital where he will be pronounced dead. So just for your listeners, he was coming back from a party in New York and he was in the elevator and he died. And when I got the call, his friend, his girlfriend who was there with him called me and she was telling me, and I was like, no. Like I didn't believe her. I was like, put the EMT on. They put the EMT on. And I was like, they were like, ma'am, we've been working on him for, however long, like the EMT knows when the person's gone. And I totally didn't believe that.
I did the exact same thing. My mom's friend called and she said, I think your mom died. And I was like, you think, or she did? Like, is she still alive? Is there a possibility? Like, let me talk to the EMT.
Yes.
And the EMT was not nice. You said your EMT was nice. Mine was not. Mine was like, she's dead. And I just like dropped the phone and I came back and I was like, wait, are you sure? Did you do this? Did you do this? Like, she's not breathing. There's no like very low heartbeat, nothing. Right. Yeah. And she was not entertaining me.
Oh God. I think that should be part of the training.
It should be. It's a huge thing to be the person to tell someone. I resonated with you during the whole story of finding out about your father. I did a very, very similar thing. And I think the disbelief.
Yeah, that one was there was so much disbelief too, because when Dahlia was 9 is when she became very sick and lost so much functionality. And we were in the hospital in the intensive care unit for 3 months. And that whole time, my dad was like my partner, I mean, he was just so in it with me and my husband. I mean, he was very, very integral to our life. And I mean, he was 80. So he was, it wasn't like, being 30 like my sister was, but we weren't focused on him and his health. We were focused on my daughter. All of us were focused on my daughter. So when I got that call, I was like, what? Disbelief.
You've mentioned throughout today that you had a great relationship with everyone in your family. Did you feel alone throughout the losses of your family, or did you still feel some connection? Because like we said earlier, grief makes you feel isolated.
Totally.
And I am an only child. I don't have any more family, so I don't know what the feeling is. Did you still feel isolated when your sister passed or your mother passed and you still had other family members to support you?
It's such a good question. When my first sister died, I remember almost immediately afterwards, definitely within that first week, because we were at Shiva, having this like light bulb moment that I felt totally isolated, and I was shocked that I felt isolated. I guess there's a lot of shock to go around in this, but I remember thinking this loss means something totally different to me and to my other sister. And that didn't seem right to me because we both lost a sister. We both lost the same person. And yet it didn't we were very close, but we didn't come together over it in the way I would have probably imagined, because everything about it was different for us, because our relationship with her had been different, because who we were with her was different. For example, she was my older sister. We were best friends, as I mentioned. She was my other sister's younger sister. They had a little bit more conflict in their relationship, unresolved. It was just different. And I've seen this even in couples where they lose a child. Again, they both lost a child. They both lost the same person. And yet they deal with grief differently, which makes you feel even more alone because the person you're supposed to be bonded to. On the other hand, there are those people who have the shared history, which you didn't have. And that is its own form of horrificness. I did have people where there was the shared memories and where we could the responsibility. I mean, after somebody dies with everything that needs to happen, there was a bit of shouldering of that responsibility.
You mentioned losing the same person, but with a different relationship. And obviously everyone experiences and goes through their grief differently. With the loss of your daughter and you and your husband and the different grief you two had, did that cause conflict in your relationship, or were you two understanding, or?
We're understanding. We're really different. So for example, the conversation you and I are having right now, for me, it's a really beautiful thing. And I'm so grateful to be able to have these kind of conversations. I feel like I could talk about my daughter all day long. Talking about your mother, we're talking about and bringing to the attention of people, these people who meant so much to us. I would do this all day. My husband would probably rather have a root canal than be in any kind of conversation, with anybody who didn't know her or anything like that. Would be excruciating for him. He understands why. I mean, I wrote a book, for God's sakes, right? I mean, he understands, but even when I do book events, he doesn't want to come. Like, he'll drive me there and he'll then, go do something and then come pick me up. It's too painful for him. So I think that's a really strong example of how we process it in very different ways.
And being understanding of it.
Yeah. Yes. Again, we're fortunate because, I can't imagine if I was like, you need to come to my book talk. I mean, I wouldn't want to be married to that. Right. No. And I get where he doesn't want to. He's a very private, very introvert, he doesn't want to. And it's very raw for him. The loss is very raw. Our relationship with her was different. He and Dahlia, they had a really magical relationship. And we had a great relationship too, but there was something about my husband and my daughter. It was the most spiritual thing I ever witnessed, was watching them together.
You talked about it a lot in your book and how you could just see how he wasn't thinking about the problems when he was with her.
Never. It was beautiful. I learned a lot from him.
And it definitely read in the book. And I think you said that in the book, that you learned to be more present during.
Yes. Hence one of the meanings of breathtaking.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I have breath or breathe tattooed on my hand.
Oh my God.
To remind me to always be present. It's so important.
It is so important. And I will tell you, I did not start off the journey that way at all. I was like, all right, what's next? Fast and problem solving and kind of always going and not being able to just be. It's still a challenge for me. I'm just 1,000 times more aware of it now.
Do you have any tools that helped you in your journey with any of your losses or all of them? Or do you have any tools that worked for some of your losses and didn't work for the others?
So for me, writing is a great tool. And I didn't start that. I was actually, as it turns out, I did write another book in my 20s that came out right after my sister died, but that was like a how-to. It had nothing to do with, it was not a memoir. But writing, so this book, Breathtaking, I wrote during Dahlia's lifetime. It was never going to be a book about Dahlia's death, nor is it. It was a book about Dahlia's life. I had to go in and add the epilogue because it was done. But writing it down, and then within that process, sharing stories about every single member of my family, allowed me not only to visit with them in the only way that I could, but also to gain some control of the narrative. I mean, things were so out of control, and being able to tell my story. And I'm always very clear that this is my story. I don't want to say this is Dahlia's story, because I know that if my husband, for example, were to write a book about Dahlia, it would be a totally different story. And I'm really cognizant of that, because when my sister died, my father wrote a book. And he was a writer. He wrote many books, but he wrote a book about that loss. And the first time he gave me the book to read, the manuscript, he said, I wrote a book about Nomi. And I read the book and I said, that's not a book about Nomi. This is a book about you and your daughter, but it's not my Nomi if I were going to write it, So I think that that's important. I didn't want him to be able to, put the stake in the ground and say, this is who Nomi was. I was like, I don't even recognize that Nomi. That was like the daughter Nomi. So, I'm clear that this is my story about my journey with Dahlia and with the other people.
I was speaking with someone the other day and they had mentioned writing as well. And they said that they wrote letters to themselves as the person that had passed. And I was like, what a great idea.
That is amazing. I love that.
Especially for like a complicated grief or something, because mine's so complicated. Yeah. I was like, I think that's a great idea because it's only through the eyes of love. We just don't see it when it is that complicated sometimes. So I think writing is great. And it shows in your book all of the love you have for everyone. It really is a love story.
Thank you.
You're so welcome. Do you have any advice for people going through a loss or anticipatory or ambiguous grief?
Yes, definitely. So first of all, I would say, we talked about how isolating it is, and there's just no getting around that. Something that really helps is to find connections of other people who are going through. It doesn't have to be the same exact thing, but it's people who can look, you and I, look how much we are able to connect on, and our losses are so different, the circumstances of them, etc., everything. So it's other people who have gone through something and having those connections where you don't have to worry that you're going to be talking about the kid who sprained their ankle at the gymnastics championship, right? Because you get each other. So I think that's number one. Number two is particularly when you're in a lengthy caregiving situation, is to really make sure that you have pieces of your identity that are not connected to being the, caregiver, nurse, medical advocate, blah, 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 all the stuff you have to be, but that you maintain some of your identity of who you are, as I say it, who I was before and who I would be after, right? Because if your entire identity is caught up in the caregiving situation, if that caregiving situation ends, who are you then, right? So I think keeping some piece of whatever that is, whether that's some friends, whether that's playing the flute, writing, whatever, doesn't matter. So I think that that's another important one. And then, I think one of the messages of my book is we are all capable of more than we think. I mean, I never would have imagined ever that I could have done 8 years as with the situation we had where, my daughter was an eyes-on patient. So myself or my husband or a nurse trained specifically in her care had to have our eyes on her around the clock. And there was a lot of very intense medical care. And we were living on the precipice every moment for 8 years. And I wouldn't have thought I could do that.
And you mentioned in your book that you were so thankful you did not know her diagnosis before.
Yes. This is so important to me. Thank you for bringing it up because, my daughter was adopted, as I mentioned, and, probably you could tell by looking, all my kids are Guatemalan, I am not. And sometimes I felt like we were given quote unquote credit because my daughter became over the years very visibly disabled, starting with having a tracheotomy and being attached to a ventilator and being in a wheelchair and hearing aids and goggles and a chest brace and leg brace, etc. So, she was extremely disabled. And some people would think, oh, look, you adopted this child who was severely disabled. And P.S., of course, there are people who do that and they are heroes in their own right. That was not me. And I wasn't comfortable for anybody to think of me that way because when I adopted, we had to fill out paperwork that said, would you be comfortable with, and then there's 57 things ranging from, the most benign medical conditions all the way through serious conditions. And I was like, no, none of it. I don't want any of it. I'm not raising my hand for that. That's why I was glad we hadn't known, because if they had said there's a little girl, she's available, you could adopt her, she's got a serious degenerative disease. And I would have been like, okay, we'll wait for the next child. I wouldn't have raised my hand. And again, I do want to acknowledge that there are lots of people who do, and they're, incredible. That was not me. So I was very glad because by the time Dahlia was diagnosed at age 5, she was my daughter. I was her mother. We were absolutely 100% meant to be together. and God forbid I had known and we hadn't been together, I can't even imagine. I am who I am today because I am her mother.
Yeah. And what a blessing to love that unconditionally.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't have happened, like you said, if you would have known. So
Yeah.
when you said that, I was like, what a great way to look at it, because you got to love her.
Yes, I got to love her. I love that.
What advice would you give to people in the caregiver role? You had mentioned to have an identity outside of being the caregiver.
Yeah.
Is there any other advice?
Yes, I would say try to find other people. Give yourself grace. You cannot. Here's what I think. We're so good at making ourselves feel bad, right? We're so good at making ourselves feel guilty. And there's no more intense time where that rears its head than in the caregiving situation. So, you're guilty if you get frustrated, for example. You look back and you think, how in the world could I have been frustrated with, so we feel guilty for that. We feel guilty if we go out and we're happy and our person is at home and not feeling like we just feel guilty of so many things. And I don't think that serves us. And I don't think that serves the person we're caring for. So I think if we can summon a little bit more grace for ourselves and for the situation, it really helps in the long run. And then I would say, this whole thing about self-care gets a bad rap because you've got to take care of yourself. I mean, it requires so much energy, physically, emotionally, spiritually, logistically, every single way. And you got to take care of yourself, even though that sometimes can feel selfish because your primary concern is taking care of this other person.
Did you find that your self-care needs were different before versus after the loss of your daughter?
Yes. It's so funny because, before I remember being like, my dream is to be bored. I wrote an article about it, why I long to be bored, because, I talk to people and I'd be like, hey, what's going on? They'd be like, oh, same old, same old. And I was like, oh my God, what must it be like to have same old, or nothing going on? I mean, our lives were so intense. I just dreamed about having time. So again, my husband and I, we never even got into bed at the same time for all those years because one of us would be in her room, after we would find ourselves we could go out to dinner. And that was so weird, right? So that what might be considered as kind of like self-care or self-care need or just regular life felt so uncomfortable to us. We were like, wait, we can just go do something. Anything we did before had to be carefully orchestrated and planned and caregivers and machinery and this and that and the other thing, And so it's still a bit of a culture shock. Like if I have a day in front of me where I don't have things planned, I'm like, ooh, that's a little uncomfortable.
I'm that way too. I definitely want something taking up my time.
Yeah.
But I was definitely like that before. I wasn't my mom's caregiver, but my mom was an alcoholic. So I was constantly worried.
Yeah.
Or getting phone calls from her drunk, or her texting me and me not knowing what version I was going to get of her. I was always on edge and always ready, on the go.
Braced for impact. And the thing is, I don't know if you feel this way, but I feel like when you live that way for so many years, braced for impact, and then that goes away, you still are living that way. I still feel like any little thing, and I'm just ready to react.
My survival mode reached new heights after she died because I was like, I don't have to worry about my mom anymore, but I'd rather have her call me drunk and be stressed about it than have to, live with this regret, live with this guilt, live with this loss, not getting to talk to her not being at my wedding.
Yeah.
All the things.
Yeah.
So I was very much in survival mode, and I realized it, and because it was hurting me physically. I could feel it, I was not taking care of myself. I wasn't eating correctly. I've always gotten my stress out through working out, and I could not even do a proper run without just breaking down or my mind being a million other places. So the survival and wanting to go is so real, so real. Do you have any other advice or things you would like to say for anyone going through any sort of loss or experience?
Yeah. I think, again, to give yourself the grace to know that it's not about getting over this. You're not going to get over it. You're going to move on with it, and it will change and you will change. And I think that's the objective, is to figure out how to integrate it. I mean, I'll always be a griever. I will grieve every single day for the rest of my life, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Those are my people, and I mourn for them and I grieve the loss of them. And I have joy and I can laugh and I can do things, because if I'm going to grieve every day for the rest of my life, I also want to be able to live life and enjoy. And I know they'd want that for me too. I mean, even Dahlia, even as all of her functionality was taken away, she still figured out a way to smile and to be silly, to laugh, to find beauty. So I do this as well, because look, if she could do it, right? And I think we all can. We can grieve. We will grieve. And there's room to have other things living alongside that grief and holding hands with it.
I read something the other day, and I've been trying to think of it frequently. It was something along the lines of, when I see my loved one again, I don't want to tell them that my life ended when theirs did. And I was like, that is such a good way to put it.
Yeah, it like hits you. That sums it up.
Yeah, they'd want us to still love and do the things and still feel them too.
Right.
And that be more purpose to do it.
Absolutely.
Jessica, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you so much.
Where can our listeners connect with you and find your book?
Yes, I love having conversations. Please reach out to me. Anybody who wants to connect. I am on Instagram and Facebook. My book, wherever you like to get your books, and it's in print and audio and ebook, of course. I also do have a podcast called I Don't Know How You Do It, and all kinds of writing. So I guess the best thing is to come to my hub, which is jessicafeinstories.com. It's Jessica Fein, F like Frank, EIN, stories.com. But I hope people will check out Breathtaking. And I am so grateful that you acknowledge that it really is, at its heart, a love story.
It is. Thank you so much, Jessica. Thank you so much for watching Lost and Found. I really hope that this episode resonated with you. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe below. There will be new episodes every Friday. And grief is fucking hard, and you don't have to do it alone. And I love you, and I hope I see you next time.